and share with y'all. First thing I want to ask is, what books by C.S. Lewis have any of y'all read?
The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. The
Okay,
Lion.
Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. It's part of a 7-book series called The Chronicles of Narnia. That was my first introduction to Lewis. I didn't bring it. Well, actually, this is this is my copy of Lion, which I have a
I've
7
read
volume
his life
set.
story too. I've read.
Okay, you've read Surprised by Joy?
Mhm.
Okay, I'll talk about that book a good bit. You can tell that my copy from when I was probably, I don't know, 8 or 9 is well worn. The way I wrote my name is kind of silly. Yeah, I've been through this one several times. My kids are starting to read them now as well. We had to buy another set for the kids because mine were so worn, but also kind of precious to me, and I knew they wouldn't take care of them. Of course, neither did I, so maybe I shouldn't have cared. But Lion, the Witch, and Wardrobe, maybe it's one of his most famous books. That's the first book of that series.
I started with the Narnia Chronicles, and then the Space Trilogy, and Screwtape Letters, and a couple others.
Okay. Who's read the Space Trilogy in here? It's not near as well known as the Narnia series. Yeah, I actually didn't read it until I was working on my dissertation. It's incredible. It's written for, the Narnia series is written for children. The Space Trilogy is written for adults. And it's not that it's like adult, like the world would, say a rated R really bad movie or something. It's just written for an adult audience. Mere Christianity is probably my favorite book other than Scripture. Does anybody know the background of Mere Christianity? How the material in that book originally came about?
No, tell us, because I
Okay.
have not read a single word. Yes.
So, Mere Christianity, Lewis was born in 1898 and lived to 1963. And so obviously that spans World War II. I'll tell you in a minute how he actually fought in World War I. But in World War II, he would have been, in his mid-40s. And so he wasn't fighting. But during some of the darkest periods of that war, especially as the Germans were bombing England, the BBC, British Broadcasting Corporation, had Lewis go on the air and give a series of radio talks about Christianity, which today sounds like, would the BBC probably wouldn't do that today to encourage the population of the nation. But that's what they did back then. And so he did these, so you can actually hear some audio. You go on Google and you can find some of the audio from him just speaking, encouraging people. It sort of reminds you, Roosevelt's fireside chats or something, where he's just kind of trying to encourage people. And so Lewis did that, and the material from those talks became this incredible book, Mere Christianity. That's how the book came about, broadcast talks during World War II to encourage the people of the UK. Any other books of Lewis's that you read? Anybody read Problem of Pain? That's one of his more well-known ones, where he talks about what theologians, what philosophers call the problem of evil, meaning the kind of the classic presentation of that problem is, if God is good, if he's all-powerful, if he's all-knowing, why is there so much evil in the world? And so he tries to answer that more from like a cerebral, argumentation perspective. It's a really, really good book. Anybody else? So those are kind of the most famous ones of Lewis. What do you know about his life?
We visited where the church was at his burial site.
Are you serious? I've never been there.
Yeah.
On one of the trips with Richard? That's awesome. That's so
I
neat.
went with a school group with an Oxford thing.
Are you
It
serious?
was awesome. Went to the pub.
Yeah.
Saw his church.
Do you know, I recently heard that the pub closed.
Oh.
Yeah. There's this famous pub there near Oxford where he went to school and then taught. The official name of the pub was the Eagle and Child. But the sort of nickname that the people who went there, they called it the Bird and the Baby. And so he and his friends, including J.R.R. Tolkien, I'll talk about more in a minute, and several other moderately famous authors.
Inklings.
Yeah, they had a group there called the Inklings, where they would go and have a pint and discuss their own works and critique each other's works. So sometimes they would meet in one of the professors' rooms at Oxford, as they would call it, or sometimes they'd go to the pub or maybe do both. And so I'd recently just heard that the pub closed. I was like, man, they should have done like a GoFundMe for Lewis fans. That thing would have been kept in business really quickly. Yeah. Yeah.
There's supposed to be a movie about his life. If it's, I've been seeing previews, but I don't know
Yeah,
if it's out yet.
there's some that have already been, there's one with Anthony Hopkins who plays Lewis.
Yeah.
Older ones. But you're right, there's one, I'm trying to remember the name of
Something
it.
about reluctant.
Reluctant Convert.
Yeah,
Yeah, that's a
something-
quote
yeah.
from one of his books, which I'll
Yeah.
mention in a minute. So yeah, and there's a one-man play that the guy goes around and does. Anybody seen that? I think it came through here recently, but anyway, so just a brief sketch of Lewis's life. He was born in 1898. Actually, he was born in Ireland. He wasn't born in England. He was born in Belfast. His lineage is more Irish. His mom, when he was 9, he was very close to his mom, but she died of cancer when he was that age. And it sort of wrecked his world. And so he struggled with that, and he prayed while she was sick for healing. His family was kind of nominally religious, sort of like we talk about cultural Christians today. And he prayed for her healing, and after she died, having seen passages in Scripture, he prayed for her resurrection. As this little 9-year-old kid saying, God, bring my mommy back. And so him going through that, her death, and then, her not returning from the dead, was likely part of his struggle with atheism for about 20 years. His father was sort of distant. They did not have a close relationship. His dad was kind of a nominal churchgoer. A lot of the reasons people in their community went to a particular church was we're Protestants and we're not like those Catholics, or vice versa. And Ireland, there's a lot of that, as you know, there's been wars, between those two groups, and so it was very political, often even more than it was a spiritual reality in their hearts. So he grew up in that environment. He was trained from a young age to be a really rigorous thinker. One of his tutors was a staunch atheist, but gave Lewis the mental framework that I think God used later. He and his brother, whose name was Warren, but he called him Warney, they were together most of their lives, even well into adulthood. He's known, many of you may have heard, he's known as Jack Lewis in many cases, and his name is actually Clive Staples Lewis, so you might understand why he went by CS or Jack. The Jack nickname is actually interesting. He was a little kid, and there was a dog that he loved, like in their neighborhood, and this dog was actually hit by a vehicle and died, and they called this dog Jaxie. Well, he comes home as this little kid and takes the name. He says to his parents, he's like, he is Jaxie, talking about himself, like in a little kid's way of, he is Jaxie, he is Jaxie. So he took the name of this dog, and that's how he became Jack. And that's actually a little part of the reason I have a son named Jackson, just because Lewis has such impact on me, and it's also a family name for Christy's grandfather. But that's how he came to be called Jack. So he grows up, he goes to Oxford, he studies. He didn't study Christianity or apologetics. He studied medieval and Renaissance literature there. He's like a big-time expert on 15th century English literature, which I don't have a lot of love for, and probably most of you don't either, but that's his actual main field. So while he's at Oxford, World War I is going on, and he ends up leaving Oxford to go fight. You're probably familiar with World War I and how horrific it was with the trench warfare, where they're fighting back and forth over the same plots of land, chemical warfare, mustard gas. It's just absolutely horrific. So he sees that. J.R.R. Tolkien saw that in person. Lewis was actually wounded, I think it was the Battle of the Somme, or maybe Ypres, but he's wounded, and he's wounded by friendly fire. There's a shell shot from the British, and it doesn't go far enough. And then nearby, 2 soldiers that were, colleagues of his, they're killed, and he's wounded. And so he has this long recovery, but about that time the war ended. So he survives, he goes back, he finishes at Oxford and later taught there. And then he later taught at Cambridge. So he taught at the 2 legendary English, universities that are probably about 1,000 years old and very old schools. So I'll tell you the story of his faith in a minute, of how he came to faith. but just kind of finishing out his career. He was a teacher, obviously an author. He was single for the vast majority of his life, and I think he thought he'd never get married. But in 1952, so he's like 54 years old, he meets this woman named Joy Davidman. Joy, actually at that time her last name was Gresham, but they met in 1952. They strike up this friendship, and in the middle of their friendship, it's a little bit hazy because for him I think it's totally platonic, but she at some point, like she there's even some evidence that she loved him before she even met him. By reading his books, that she was like, I'm gonna meet this guy, I'm gonna go marry this guy. There's some evidence of that, like amongst her friends, that she was like, across the Atlantic, she targeted this guy, I'm gonna go get to know him. And she was, well, I'll tell you the whole story. So she had a rough marriage at that time, and her own marriage ends up falling apart. Her husband was unfaithful, actually had an affair with her cousins. Really, so her own husband was unfaithful and a violent alcoholic. So her marriage falls apart, and she's writing letters to Lewis, getting feedback on her own writing, and she ends up coming to the UK with her sons. One of the reasons she may have come to the UK was because in her past life, she didn't feel this way anymore, but in her past life, she'd been a communist. And you know that time period, the Red Scare, and what's his name, McCarthyism, all that stuff, the House Un-American Activities Committee, all this is going on, and she wasn't that way anymore. She had become a Christian, but she knew that people sometimes with communism in their past would be targeted. So she comes to the UK and wants to stay there, and under the terms set for her by the British government, she couldn't even work. And she, at one point, is about to be deported. And so Lewis ends up marrying her in a civil ceremony only, just as a marriage of convenience to take care of this woman in this difficult situation. Isn't that interesting? Like, wow. We can talk about the ethics of that. I'm not sure, but he's doing it out of kindness to try to help her. They didn't even live together, at least at first. So the next year after they're married in only civil ceremony, she falls in her kitchen and breaks her leg, and she goes in the hospital. And in the process, they find out she has incurable cancer. And so she's going through this, and Lewis, it's just a cool story. Lewis realizes, I love this woman. And he has an Anglican priest friend come in and perform a religious ceremony at her bedside, thinking she's dying. He cares really well for her, and what happens is she goes into remission, and they get 3 years together. And he writes almost a little bit risque. He says, we enjoyed all the aspects of marriage. And he didn't expect that would happen for him. And so they have this wonderful, it's not very long, but this wonderful fullness of love and marriage. And she does end up dying in 1960. And he wrote a book you may have heard of. Has anybody read A Grief Observed?
I think it is.
It's a fascinating story about A Grief Observed, because he marries this woman out of convenience. It's not a love relationship, but then he really loves her and struggles after her death. And he wrote this book basically like as a diary. He didn't write it for publication. He wrote it as kind of his own diary of his own struggle with God. So I mentioned, Karen, you'd read Problem of Pain. He writes Problem of Pain pretty soon after he becomes a Christian. And I told you it's more of like a mental, let's walk through kind of the logic of the Christian faith in light of suffering. This is like a book about the head. This is a book of the heart, dealing with God. Where are you in the midst of this? So these two books actually go together really well as like a full Christian response to suffering in the world. And you read this, and sometimes you're like, is he allowed to say that? And then there's this really beautiful image as you go through this book, because he talks early on that he's praying to the Lord, and he feels like it's a shut door in his face. And the image of the door kind of changes throughout the book, where eventually it's an open door. So he wrote it kind of as a personal diary reflection, and then ended up publishing it under a different name. You know what happened? people started giving him the book and saying, you should read this. This guy gets you. Right? And finally he had to come out and say, I wrote the book. That's the story of A Grief Observed. And it's a phenomenal book. So Lewis himself lived a couple more years after Joy. Does anyone know what day he died? 1963. Take a guess as to what day?
Valentine's Day?
November 22nd.
JFK.
Same day JFK
Yeah,
died.
that's
Actually, Aldous Huxley, the famous author, died the same day as well. And of course, both of their deaths were greatly overshadowed by the assassination of an American president, which many of you remember. Same day was when Lewis died. So that's kind of a brief intro to his life.
What did he die of? It's not old age, he wasn't old enough, was he? I don't know. I don't know how old
I
he was.
don't know a lot about that, Melanie. That's a good question. I may have known that
How
years
old
ago so he was 65.
That's not old.
Yeah. I don't think it was cancer or anything like that. I don't think his heart was in great shape, but I don't remember exactly. And I should, because I'm sure I read about
I didn't
it.
mean to put you on the spot.
No, that's all right.
I just wondered if it was cancer or something, but it wasn't
I don't
something
think it was
long,
cancer.
long
I think it was
thing.
kind of quick. Yeah, now I'm curious, Melanie. I need to go back and look at that because I've forgotten. His brother Warnie actually outlived him, even though he's a little bit older. So, what about Lewis and beauty? So, kidney failure. Okay, sorry, not heart. It was kidney failure. Thank you, Karen. Live research right here.
Yeah, I was fixing to look at that.
So, Lewis, you mentioned you read this book. This book is Surprised by Joy. It's not talking about his wife, Surprised by Joy. It's not that. He wrote this before he met her. But this is a story, it's autobiographical, so he's talking about his own life, but it's not his whole life. It's basically from his early life up to his salvation. So you could call it like a spiritual autobiography or really an extended testimony of salvation. And so early on in that book, page 7, I spent a lot of time on page 7 when I was doing my research, he says this about an experience that he had. And remember, I told you his upbringing was sort of Christian in name only. He says, once in those very early days, my brother brought into the nursery, where their kids' room, the lid of a biscuit tin. So think of almost like, we get those like Danish cookies, at Christmas or whatever, the royal dance or whatever they're called. It's a lid of a biscuit tin like that. And Warnie has basically taken this and made almost like a diorama or something, we might call it, like kids do in a shoebox. So once in those very early days, my brother brought into the nursery the lid of a biscuit tin, which he had covered with moss and garnished with twigs and flowers so as to make it a toy garden or a toy forest. He's just using his imagination, making something. That was the first beauty I ever knew. He says, it made me aware of nature, not indeed as a storehouse of forms and colors, but as something cool, dewy, fresh, exuberant. I do not think the impression was very important at the moment, but it soon became important in memory. So that's an important aspect of this, that there's kind of this nostalgic aspect for him, like thinking back to his childhood and his first experience of something like, this is amazing, this is beautiful, just because his older brother made this thing. He's really young. As long as, this is a big statement, as long as I live, my imagination of paradise will retain something of my brother's toy garden. And every day, he's talking about from his house in Ireland, and every day there were what we called the Green Hills, like looking out the window or whatever. That is the low line of the Castlereagh Hills, which we saw from the nursery windows. They were not very far off, but they were to children quite unattainable. It'd be like a kid living, in East Tennessee and looking out the window and seeing the mountains, and it feels like it's way off, even though it's just a few miles, right? They taught me longing. Sehnsucht, that's a German word, I'll talk about in a minute, made me for good or ill, and before I was 6 years old, a votary of the blue flower. There's a lot of background there, but he's talking about romanticism. If you ever heard of the romantic movement, like in the 1800s, this kind of almost obsession with beauty or looking for beauty and emotional things in the world. So I wrote my dissertation on his concept of Sehnsucht. That's a German word that means desire or longing. And so he's looking at his brother's, this little kid piece of art, right? I bring home 8 of them from church every Sunday. But for him, it opened his eyes and his mind to beauty in the world. He's looking outside. So there's man-made beauty that his brother made. He's looking outside and he sees the mountains. That's God's beauty, right? Natural beauty that God's put in the world. And it started him on this course of saying, I feel pleasure. I feel something good when I look at those, but I want more. It leaves me wanting more. That's what that word Sehnsucht means. It's kind of this mixed idea of pleasure and desire and longing for more. You can't really put it into one English word. And so that he identifies it as that. He also talks a few pages later in this about reading the Beatrix Potter book, the Peter Rabbit author, reading her book Squirrel Nutkin. Has anybody read Squirrel Nutkin? Did you read that as a kid?
I did.
Yeah, so he says that as a kid I read that, and it introduced to me what he calls the idea of autumn. And he capitalizes autumn. And it's a little bit, kind of weed through, or wade through what he's saying to understand it, but there's this very mixed set of sensations that he has. But let me just ask you, when you think of autumn or fall, what comes to your mind?
Colored leaves.
Okay, colors, right? The richness of the colors. Okay, what else?
Winter coming.
Okay. No. I think that's an important part of this.
Yeah.
I think that's an important part of this because I go back and forth in my mind. Do I like spring? Because I love spring and fall here. We grew up in Central Florida. We didn't have seasons. So I'm like, do I like spring more because I'm coming out of the winter, but summer's coming and I'm gonna sweat? Or do I like fall more because I'm gonna have summer and I'm done sweating, but I know winter's coming? There's that mixed feeling.
Yeah.
Right? So we talk about the colors, the richness of that. I mean, for me, I start thinking Christmas is coming. There's excitement there. Even nostalgia, thinking back to when I was a kid and I knew Christmas was coming. And then this idea of autumn. I mean, there's something dying, right? The leaves are dying and falling, but there's beauty in that. But winter's coming, right? So I think that's all mixed up in his mind, even as a kid, reading those books. And so he begins to talk in this book and a lot of others of his books about a very mixed set of sensations that he has in these certain moments that he calls Sehnsucht, that he uses this German word for. So it's pleasure, it's desire, it's longing. He'll even call it ache sometimes. If you think about, I loved, like Christy and I spent, a year 900 miles apart while we were dating. And, absence makes the heart grow fonder, right? There's that, you have that love, but there's also kind of an ache or missing someone along with it. So he'll talk about it as ache. He'll say loss, autumn, beauty, romanticism. He writes to a friend his whole life. His friend named Arthur Greaves. There's a book like this of their letters. It's called They Stand Together, that they wrote back and forth. And he'll even write to Arthur and write, I saw it, capital I, today. Like he's walking through a meadow and he had that sense of, oh, this is so beautiful, but I want more. And so he even just uses a pronoun, it. It's a passionate search for him for beauty and what's behind beauty. Where's this coming from? Even as he's an atheist. That's the amazing thing for me. He's trying to get at the source of beauty. Why does it give him this pleasurable feeling, but also this unfulfilled feeling? And by the way, I find that this, as I work through, and this is just, I have a big section of my office of all of his major works, I found this concept in every one of his major works. Now, he doesn't use the name, the German word, all the time. He'll call it different things. Sometimes he'll call it joy with a capital J, not the name Joy, not his future wife. Just he'll call it joy. I experienced this. It even shows up in his fiction. So I have a quote from Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe. Do you remember the name of the lion? Aslan. I know Richard talked about Aslan a lot, so I know you guys are familiar from that angle as well. So when Aslan first shows up in the book, and Aslan is clearly a representative of Jesus, right? This is allegorical. Aslan, I mean, spoiler alert, but Aslan dies for the traitor in the story and then comes back and restores the traitor, forgives him. It's clearly a Christ figure. But when they first hear the name Aslan, the 4 children who are kind of the main characters, they don't know who he is. But they hear his name, and here's what it says. And this reminds me of Lewis's own experience. And now a very curious thing happened. None of the children knew who Aslan was any more than you do, right? Because you're reading the book, like, who's that? But the moment the beaver had spoken these words, remember animals can talk in this book, everyone felt quite different. Perhaps it has happened to you in a dream that someone says something which you don't understand, but in the dream it feels as if it had some enormous meaning, either a terrifying one which turns the whole dream into a nightmare, or else a lovely meaning too lovely to put into words, which makes the dream so beautiful that you remember it all your life and are always wishing you could get into that dream again. Sounds like what he said. It was like that now. At the name of Aslan, each one of the children felt something jump in his inside. Edmund, he's the traitor, felt a sensation of mysterious horror. Peter, the oldest one, felt suddenly brave and adventurous. Susan felt it as if some delicious smell or some delightful strain of music, that's important because he ties this to art and music a lot, had just floated by her. And Lucy, she's the youngest one, the one who's most full of faith and trusting in Aslan. Lucy got the feeling you have when you wake up in the morning and realize that it is the beginning of the holidays or the beginning of summer. He's put it through the eyes of a child. So I think that's a paragraph that's like, it's autobiographical for him. It's what he's talked about for himself. They hear the name of Aslan, which is a Christ figure in their story, and they have this sense of, oh, what is that? This pleasurable, it's not pleasurable for the one who's, a traitor, but there's something that's a strong meaning. It's connected with art or music. And so, I could go through all of his major works and give you examples of that. I almost think Lewis put it in his works almost like a key to unlock the meaning that's really woven throughout his own life. So stop for a minute and think about if you have any moments like that in your own life. I want to see if any of you can share this. Has there been a moment where you watched or heard something, is a film or a piece of art, or a piece of music, or you were at the Grand Canyon, something where you saw something of such powerful beauty that you were absolutely just enthralled, perhaps speechless, and it was so powerful it almost hurt. And as you think back to those moments, you might even have a strong desire to feel that again, that kind of nostalgic aspect, to get back there, to get to the source of that sensation. Have any of y'all ever had anything like that that you'd be willing to share, Jim?
Yeah, the first time we just went to the Grand Canyon, it was our 7th time. We loved it out there, but the first time we went to the 90s, and we happened to be in Phoenix and just on a lark, decided, got a room right there at the rim, and so we drove to the first overlook and pulled in behind a bus of Japanese businessmen. So
Okay.
all had their cameras, had their ties on, And we went out one of these overlooks and went hung way out over the wall. And as soon as one of these Japanese guys, he just threw his arms out and just yelled.
Wow.
It was so out of character, and I thought that was what I was feeling inside.
And they're a very reserved culture.
Oh yeah, I didn't do that, but I just still remember that to this day.
That's awesome.
In the 90s,
Yeah.
It still does that to me when I see it now.
Yeah. Somebody else had a hand up. I thought, Melanie.
Mine is holding the grandchildren.
Okay.
I can't remember my kids being baby. I have a really bad memory. But to hold the grandchildren, and just this weekend we got to hold the one who looks a lot like his daddy, and that's our son. So it's just the fascinating, the feel of that little baby's head next to your face and stuff. It's just, it hurts. It literally hurts.
That's a good example.
Yeah.
I experience that a lot with our hymns.
Yep.
When we're singing, I'm over here trying not to cry, thinking nobody's looking at me.
Yeah.
I'm over here crying, but it's out of that mixed feeling.
Yeah.
Definitely.
Anybody else? I remember, I haven't been to England, but my sister and I, before Christy and I got married, we went on a trip to Europe and went to the Alps. And I just remember having gone up one of these gondolas and you're already up in the mountains, and then you look up to see the next part, and it's like the clouds are covering part of it. There's snow up there. This is during the summer. They're so beautiful. It's so powerful. It's really also overwhelming. There's this sense of smallness. So it's a mixed feeling then. It's a sense of heaven in a lot of ways for me. It's like just, how beautiful that is, and thinking about what it's going to be like to be with the Lord. My absolute, I can't play it on there because my phone is recording this. I'll play it on here real quick for you, not the whole thing, but my absolute favorite piece of music in the world, and I like a lot of different kinds of music. I like rock and roll and all kinds of stuff, but my favorite piece of music in the world is Bach's Air on the G string. So you guys are probably familiar with that piece. I'm sorry, I'm really, I don't know why I'm weepy today. But it's the name of that piece is Orchestral Suite number 3 in D major. There's a movie that gave me this sense of, I think what Lewis is talking about. It's a really, really dark movie. It's a movie called The Children of Men. Anybody seen it? The Children of Men. It's based on a book by a British author, a lady named P.D. James. She died a few years ago. She's mostly known for her mystery novels. She claimed to be a Christian. She had some strange beliefs, but she claimed to be a Christian. She wrote a book called The Children of Men that was made into a movie 10, 15 years ago. Clive Owen is the main actor in it, if you're familiar with him. And I'm going to kind of tell it. So if you really want to see this movie, plug your ears. I'm going to tell you the outline of the movie. It was one of the hardest movies to watch I've ever watched. It's rated R. I don't watch a ton of those. But I watched it as kind of working through this topic. In the book, or in the story from the movie, it's this post-apocalyptic story where all of a sudden in the world, no one can have children. Everybody. It's like worldwide infertility. And because of that, the world descends into chaos and war because we tie so much hope to the next generation. And of course, we were going through infertility during that time. So I told Christy, don't watch this. And in the story, she's British. England is the only country that has any semblance of order, basically because they've become like a fascist state. They like shut down their borders, militaristic, just to maintain some sense of order. There's been nuclear, war in other countries. And England is the only place that has any sense of order, but even there's a lot of violence. And there's war between the government and these different factions. Well, what happens is in the middle of all this, shockingly, one girl becomes pregnant. And she's a virgin. And of course, I don't know that I'd write the story that way, but you see it's a clear reference. And she keeps it a secret. And there's this secret group that you can trust more than the government. You can't trust the government. She doesn't trust the government because she thinks they'll turn her into some science experiment. How is she pregnant and nobody else is? And so there's Clive Owen is the guy who's tasked with escorting this girl to this secretive group that has like a ship that can get her away to true safety. And he's navigating like actual battlefields with this woman who's very pregnant and trying to hide it because, again, nobody gets pregnant and it would be huge attention. She could be killed or whatever. And it's like I said, it's a very, very dark movie. Language, drug use, there's widespread suicide just because people have no hope. And so at the end of the movie, he's navigating like this actual battlefield, trying to get her to safety. And there's these different warring factions, the government and this splinter group. And he ends up finding a path to get her to safety, but he goes through this group of soldiers and they see that she's pregnant. They stop. After all the darkness of the movie, it's like a light. And this one soldier's like this, and I was just watching it, weeping. Because it's like, that's the gospel. That's what Jesus did. Prince of Peace, right? And they see this woman that's pregnant and they stop fighting. And it's like, wow. So it's a sense of beauty, but also loss, right? Desire for God to come and fix it, you know? And so I actually wrote about that. I got to write about movies in my dissertation. It's pretty fun, you know? A lot of people have a lot of boring topics in their dissertation, but I get to watch movies and listen to music and write about it. So why this sense of loss and longing? Because God is the source of all beauty. And our sin separates us from God. Because this world, though he's made it with beauty and wonder and goodness, it's still marred by sin, right? It's not our true home. Right? It points us to God, and we enjoy the beauty of this world, but it's not the end, right? It's not the end goal. So in his book, The Weight of Glory, which I have here, this is where he explains the working of this idea of Sehnsucht most fully. He says, this is a bit of a longer quote, but just stay with me. He says, in speaking of this desire for our own far-off country, this desire for that, which we find in ourselves even now, that desires in us now, I feel a certain shyness. I am almost committing an indecency. I am trying to rip open the inconsolable secret in each one of you, the secret which hurts so much that you take your revenge on it by calling it names like nostalgia and romanticism and adolescence. The secret also which pierces with such sweetness that when in very intimate conversation the mention of it becomes imminent, we grow awkward and affect to laugh at ourselves. The secret we cannot hide and cannot tell, though we desire to do both. We cannot tell it because it is a desire for something that has never actually appeared in our experience. You hear what he's saying? Like, you know, we don't experience the fullness of God in this life, but beauty points us to that. We desire a country that's our true home that we've never actually been to. We cannot hide it because our experience is constantly suggesting it, and we betray ourselves like lovers at the mention of a name. Our commonest expedient is to call it beauty and behave as if that had settled the matter. The books or the music in which we thought the beauty was located will betray us if we trust to them, right? Beauty of this world is not the end goal. I mean, it's not enough for us, right? It won't save us. It doesn't give us eternal life. It's not the fulfillment of who we are. It was not in them, it only came through them, and what came through them was longing. These things, the beauty, the memory of our own past, are good images of what we really desire, right? The beauty we've experienced in the world points us to our ultimate desire, to God. But if they are mistaken for the thing itself, they turn into dumb idols, breaking the hearts of their worshipers. If we make anything in this world our God, it's an idol, and it doesn't fulfill us. He says, don't get stuck with the pointer. See what it's pointing to. For they are not the thing itself. They are only the scent of a flower we have not found, the echo of a tune we have not heard, news from a country we have never yet visited. That's it. That's what he's talking about. So Lewis, even though he was an atheist for about 20 years, is still trying to experience that feeling over and over again. While he's an atheist, he's searching. And his first published work, I wouldn't be surprised if no one in this room has read this. It's called Spirits in Bondage. Anybody read Spirits in Bondage? It's a set of poems. I'm not a big poetry guy. I didn't love it. But in that book, some of which I think he wrote while he was in World War I, he talks about, he gives, there's some poems that I would describe as blasphemous. They're that wrong and wicked in terms of how he describes God. But there are other poems where he's like talking about beauty and saying, I want to see God. I want to find. It's so weird because it's like this, you can see the struggle in his heart as he's writing these poems, the struggle between searching for God and kind of hating God at the same time. It's fascinating to watch. So he ends up, as I said, he survives the war, he becomes a professor, he ends up becoming friends with other writers. One of them was J.R.R. Tolkien, who was a devout Catholic, had a major influence on Lewis's eventual conversion. And Tolkien keeps telling Lewis, the beauty and the wonder that you see in the world and the great stories and the great art, that points to God. And finally, after many years, Lewis ends up acknowledging God's existence. And that's when he says, I became the most reluctant convert in all of England. And I don't think he's a Christian at that point. He's just a theist, believing there is a God. But from there, through studying scripture, I think he goes to church some even, through the work of the Holy Spirit, he ends up finally believing Jesus is the Son of God. He believes in Jesus and is saved. And as you know, he became one of the great apologists of the 20th century, still with a massive impact today. Books that we mentioned, Mere Christianity, Problem with Pain. So, was Lewis right about beauty? Was he scriptural in his understanding of beauty?
What's an apologist?
Someone who defends the faith. Apologetics is not apologizing for being a Christian. It's from a Greek word, apologia, which means defense, a reason for your faith. So that can be defensive or offensive. Defensive meaning someone says Christianity is wrong because of this, and you explain why they're wrong. Or you say offensively, and I don't mean like you're offending people. I mean you're going on the offense. You say Christianity is better than Buddhism because of X, Y, and Z, or whatever. Not in a hateful way, in a loving way, but you're defending the faith. That's apologetics. I have to go way over. When should I stop by now?
So you didn't get finished, I suppose?
Well, I just don't want lunch to be cold or whatever.
It should be in the warmer.
Okay, so I have a lot of verses to back this up, but Scripture teaches us about God's beauty. David says, I want to gaze upon the Lord in his temple, to gaze upon his beauty, right? We see Scripture talking about seeing God face to face in heaven. Isaiah prophesies a lot about this. So we know in Scripture, not only is God beautiful and the source of all beauty, and by the way, I don't just mean physically. I think to see God in person, obviously he is beautiful, but I don't make that think like, oh, he's pretty. We don't mean that, right? I think a lot of it refers to his character as well, right? His holiness, his love. The gospel's beautiful, right? And the way that he saves us despite our rebellion against him. So it's kind of broad in that understanding. But also God shares beauty with us, right? Psalm 19, the heavens declare the glory of God. Isaiah 62, 2 and 3 says, the nations shall see your righteousness and all the kings your glory, and you shall be called by a new name that the mouth of the Lord will give. Talking to God's people. You shall be a crown of beauty in the hand of the Lord. So he shares his beauty with his people, and we point to him. I mean, that's sanctification, right? As we become more like Jesus, the beauty of our character points to God. So he shares his beauty with us. Excuse me. In creation, in nature, in man-made art, in the transformation in the lives of his people, he demonstrates his beauty. He shares his beauty with us. But I also think God draws men to himself through beauty. I think Lewis says that, and I have a bunch of verses, but I'm just going to share one. And I think this is the single verse that shows this most powerfully. If I can find Ecclesiastes in my Bible, that's this one. There it is. Ecclesiastes 3:11. Actually, I want to read it to you in ESV. I just remembered I have it here. ESV, I think, is a little better translation for our purposes. He has made everything beautiful in its time. You've heard that, right? Mm-hmm. So clearly talking about God's beauty put into creation. Now listen to the second half of this verse. Also, he has put eternity into man's heart, yet so that he cannot find out what God has done from the beginning to the end. If I were to pick one verse in all of Scripture that fits with what Lewis is saying, it's that verse. God has made everything beautiful, and he's given us a sense in our heart that this life is not all there is. And the beauty in the world points us to that there's eternity in our hearts. We're made for a world beyond this one where God himself, the source of all beauty, is. You see that? I hadn't thought of that verse when I was writing this. I was just going through, okay, let me do my scriptural research. Let me search all the times of beauty. And I was like, whoa! When I came on that verse, I was like, that's it. That's what he's talking about. And I had never connected it before. Now here's what's amazing, and I'll do this part quickly, but here's what's amazing as you move from a Christian worldview into the secular world. Secular philosophers who don't know Jesus, many of who don't even believe in God, they will say similar things. Plato talks about things like this, Immanuel Kant, the German philosopher, and a third guy who you might not be as familiar with, named Arthur Schopenhauer. Anybody heard of Schopenhauer, the philosopher? He's super pessimistic. He lived from 1788 until 1860. It's kind of, his life is like almost comically depressing. His paternal grandmother died after having gone mad. His father likely committed suicide. Schopenhauer himself had a terrible relationship with his own mom. He had a violent outburst against a woman who apparently annoyed him. He pushed her down a flight of stairs and had to pay damages for a long time for the permanent injuries she experienced. At one time, he gets into this argument with Hegel, famous German philosopher, and is publicly embarrassed. In 1840, he writes an essay for a contest in Denmark. He's the only one who submits a contribution, and he still loses. I mean, it's just like comically depressing life. So he has this very pessimistic view of life. And even though he's a German in the 17 and 1800s, a lot of his views are like Eastern, almost like Buddhist, where, you know, Buddhists will say you need to deny all your desires, right? You're not going to experience happiness or nirvana, as they would say, until you stop desiring anything, which is kind of, to me, that's self-defeating, because am I supposed to desire not a nirvana?
Yeah.
Because that's a desire, right? But anyway, so he'll pull in some of those ideas. And he says, trying to fulfill any desire is pointless or empty. Life is just, it's a constant grinding of your will. You're going to try to seek things and you're never going to get there. It's very dark. But Schopenhauer writes this. He says, I get a breath of fresh air. I get a temporary respite from that grinding of the will when I see something of beauty. He says, and when I'm doing that, when I'm looking at or perceiving something that's truly beautiful, I'm touching the transcendent. Now, he doesn't say God, he doesn't say Jesus, but he says, I get beyond the grinding and the pain of this world when I see something beautiful. I think he's agreeing with Ecclesiastes 3:11. I think he's showing the impact of the image of God, right? We talked in here in Theology 101 a lot about that. The image of God sets us apart from the rest of creation. God is beautiful. He's made his creation with beauty. He's made us to recognize beauty and appreciate it and even make it ourselves as we write a song or make art. We are made to experience joy from beauty. And I don't think that evolutionary or naturalistic explanations of the world can explain that. You know what I mean by a naturalist? A naturalist, I don't mean someone who's like just a scientist. I mean someone who believes that this material world is all there is. There's no God, there's no afterlife, there's nothing. That's a very prevalent view, especially in university life these days. Naturalism, it's just the natural world, that's it. But and they would say that we're all the results of cosmic accidents, right? There's no plan guiding this. It's all the result of accidents, which I don't think makes any sense from a mathematical standpoint. You cannot get there in terms of things growing in complexity. The law of entropy states that everything reduces in complexity. Just look at my kid's room after one day, right? One day, that's the law of entropy, or your garden or whatever. Things tend towards lack of complexity and lack of organization. But evolution says the opposite, going against that law. Naturalistic mindset says the opposite. It says, well, these things all came to be and they're an accident and there's no purpose and meaning in any of them. I don't think naturalism can explain our shared experience of beauty. Why is it that those Japanese businessmen, probably most of them not Christians, if not all, I've been to Japan and it's less than 1%. Why would they pretty universally acknowledge this is beautiful if we're all the result of chemical accidents? Why would they share that recognition of it, the appreciation? Beauty is not, doesn't really help in natural selection. You know what I mean? Evolution works, they claim that it works by natural selection, that the fittest for survival will survive. How does beauty make an animal stronger? Right? There's no real evolutionary, they have to really bend over backwards to describe evolutionary purposes for that. So I don't think that that worldview can explain our shared experience of beauty. So there's apologetic value to Lewis's understanding here. Because our worldview, Christianity, makes sense of beauty in the world. Other worldviews don't. And yet beauty is universally experienced. And something like a green, obviously we would, beauty's in the eye of the beholder. Oh, that girl's pretty. Well, sometimes, no, she's ugly, or whatever. We might argue about those kind of things. But there are things that we would universally acknowledge as beautiful, like a sunset or the Grand Canyon or Rembrandt or whatever. Why is that? It's because God has made us to be like himself. We're made in his image, to see beauty, to acknowledge it, to even create it as reflections of his own character. And so Lewis, I think his argument is true from, obviously it shares his own testimony, and there's many others who have come to faith like that. I think we in the church should use that in our explanation of the gospel. We're a lot better at arguments from the head, apologetics from the head, well, because of this reason, these logical, and we need those arguments, but I think we also need arguments of the heart. There was a study done years ago by a guy named Paul Vitz. Vitz wrote a book called Faith of the Fatherless. And he talks about how so many prominent atheists, Friedrich Nietzsche, Richard Dawkins, more recently, Christopher Hitchens, these guys that have attacked Christianity, a huge percentage of prominent atheists were not argued out of belief in God. They weren't presented with reason X, Y, and Z, and this is why you can't give evidence for God. It's that they experienced pain or suffering or trauma. It was emotional. And then they went looking for arguments. It was pain of the heart. It was often a father issue, faith of the fatherless. Dad was unfaithful, their dad was abusive or whatever, and they projected that onto God. And so Vitz's argument is that a lot of my point in bringing him up is that we have to connect with people's hearts too. Christianity makes sense of the beauty and the emotion that we experience in the world way better than any other worldview does, way better than atheism does. I'll end with this one quote. This is my dissertation. It's really pretty, isn't it?
What? It's beautiful.
Yeah, I just want to read to you one story. This is from Ethel Waters. Anybody heard of Ethel Waters, the famous blues singer? As an African-American legendary blues singer, Ethel Waters was a pioneer in the entertainment industry. She had many well-known performances on Broadway, was nominated for an Academy Award. Did you know that she sang at many of Billy Graham's evangelistic crusades? Though she claimed to have been a wild little girl, she saw beauty while at church that impacted her life and ultimately led to her salvation. This is a quote from her. Though dancing, being chased by the boys, and mysteries of human birth all fascinated me, my greatest interest when I was 11 lay in the church. Though I was a Catholic, I recognized, as I said, that her friend Louise's little Protestant churches had something. I'd watch the grown-ups praying and would get the same feeling they had of elation, exaltation, of being carried above and beyond oneself. The beauty that came into the tired faces of the very old men and women excited me. All week long, so many of them were confused and inarticulate, but on Sunday, in the church, they had no difficulty expressing themselves both in song and talk. The emotion that had invaded them was so much bigger than they. Some would rock, some would cry, some would talk with eloquence and fire, their confusions and doubts dispelled. And oh, those hymns. Karen was still in here, that's what she said. On the last night of a revival meeting at her church, she said, nobody had come that night to the meeting. Nobody but the very old people who were always there. I was praying hard and hopefully asking God, what am I seeking here? What do I want of you? Help me. If nothing happens, I can't come back here anymore. And then it happened. The peace of heart and of mind, the peace I had been seeking all my life.
I know that never again, so long as I live, can I experience that wonderful reaction I had that night in that little church. Love flooded my heart, and I knew I had found God, and that now and for always I would have an ally, a friend close by to strengthen me and cheer me on. I don't know exactly what happened or when I got up. I don't even know whether I talked, but the people who were there that night were astounded. Afterward, they told me that I was radiant and like one transfixed. They said that the light in my face electrified the whole church, and I did feel full of light and warmth. Now, obviously, we don't divorce that type of experience from the truth of the gospel, right? It's not just, oh, it's just emotional. I just felt something. It's the truth of the gospel that sets us free. But we are complete beings, head and heart, emotions and rationality. And I think Lewis's experience and Waters' experience points us to the power of beauty to draw people to God. So, any questions? There's a lot more I could share.
How long did you work on that?
Well, my entire doctoral process was 5 years. The dissertation was, I guess, about 2 years, but 1 year of really solid. And I wrote the last like 30 to 40% of it. I told my church, I said, I have to finish this. I'm just preaching for the next 6 weeks and doing nothing else. And they were very gracious in that. So I went up to this kind of hidden study I had at my first church and locked myself in there and just wrote like crazy and finished it. And so the last push was probably a third of it, just in about 6 weeks. But yeah, so it was a fun topic. As you can tell, I'm pretty passionate about it. I'm sorry I was kind of weepy today, but I haven't thought about this stuff in a long time. So
Well, thanks.
yeah.
Yes, thank you.
Makes me wanna go check it out.